Daf is Daf Peiches, and we finished yesterday the Agadata, so we're up to the two dots. Yosom Sheshchato Olav Apotropsin, which you'll see parallel to Tosus Divya Maschil Masnisen. And we learned in the Mishnah that if a Yosom has two Apotropsim and each one brought a Korban Pesach and was Memane this Yosom on his Korban Pesach, so now he has the potential of either one of two Karbonos, then it all depends on what he wants. He'll make the decision in Ratzon. Shmami no, the Gemara says, derived from this, Yesh Breira. Whenever you have something that's unclear at its time, and it'll be only clarified later on, that clarification operates lemafreya retroactively to impact on the original action. So that when we have two minus, one minui on one carbon, by virtue of one apotropos and the other on the other, the Yasom later on will decide which minui was chal. So there's a decision later on that impacts lemafreya at the time of the original minui and the shchita of the Korban Pesach. Of course, the Gemara is not so excited about Shema Mino Yesh Breira because there's a very strong school of thought that holds Ein Breira. And therefore the Gemara is going to try to refute this proof. Amar Rav Zera. Rav Zera says we cannot derive from this Mishnah that Yesh Breira. You'll ask me, how could the Yasam later on decide whether he wants this carbon or that carbon? The answer is based on a pasuk. The pasuk says in the parasha of Korban Pesach in Parashas Bo, I'll read the whole pasuk. It says, "Sel beis avos, sel abayis." Now, we're going to emphasize these two words, sel abayis. And that means that there's something called a Baal Habayis, and he's called the Avos at the beginning of the pasuk. Sel beis avos, the Av is considered the Av Labayis, or the Baal Habayis. And Mikol Makom. Mikol Makom means that once you have the status of Baal Habayis, you can impose your will upon the Bnei Habayis. So anyone who's called a Ben Bayis is subject to the decision, which would be absolutely binding, of the Baal Habayis. And in this case of the Yosom, since he doesn't have a biological father, the apotropos now replaces his father, and he, the Yosom, is considered one of the bebeso of the apotropos, and therefore the apotropos doesn't need the das, he doesn't need the approval of the Yosom, because when it comes to the status of a balabayis, as we'll see in the case of Ketanim, biological children, the balabayis has the right to impose his will on the Bnei Habayis. And we'll see that here in the Brisa. Ton Rabbanan. Again, it says Sel Habayis, which means that there's such a thing called a Balabayis, and he could shech the Pesach on behalf of the Bnei Habayis, even against their will. Malamit she'adar mevi v'shochet al yidei. Al yidei means on behalf of Bito, Bino Bito HaKetanim. And in that case, the Balabayis has the authority to impose his will on the Bnei Habayis that include Bino Ubito HaKetanim, Val Yidei Avdo v'Shifchaso HaKnanim. And there's also a parallel status of Balabayis and Bnei Habayis vis-a-vis the relationship between the Adon and his Eved, or his Shifcha Knanis. And therefore, based on that authority of the Balabayis, Bein Midaitam Ubein Shalom Midaitam, which means that we're not dealing here with Breira. Breira means when you have an undetermined action that will be determined later on, but here it's determined from the get-go because of the halacha Bein Shalom Midaitam, which invests all the authority in the Adon, or in the father vis-a-vis his biological children who are ketanim, and therefore we don't need the das of the Yosom in the case of apotrosim, of the ben ubito ketanim in the case of a biological father, bein midatam, bein shalom midatam. So this has nothing to do with breira. In fact, the decision is made totally by the Balabais, who, again, either the biological father or the apotropos. And that means that they, the children, or the Yosam, does not even have the veto power that we normally invest in someone. Usually, if I operate on your behalf, the premise is that you would be happy and you would approve. If at the end of the day you find out about it and you disapprove, then the whole deal is off. That's only when I need your das and I can operate on your behalf to do the Maisa, but the das is your das. And therefore you have the power of Mecha to make a protest and veto. But in the case of a Balabais, his status is such that he can force upon the Bnei Abayis his decision. He has total authority from A to Z to control the Chalos, and therefore there's no possibility of Mecha. They cannot come and say, we object. However, if his children are already mature, they are Bnei Das. If his Eved is an Eved Ivri, and how much more so in the case of his wife, all the above you can operate on their behalf, but only as their agent, so to speak. But the authority is vested in the person himself or herself, whether it's Beno, whether it's Bito Agdolim, whether it's Avdo Vishivchasa Ivrim, and certainly Ishto. In all those cases, the decision is going to be in the hands of the person for whom we are operating. There's no halacha here, Balabais. Balabais only works with regard to either Ketanim or with regard to Avodim, if they're an Eved Knani, or with regard to a Yasam in the case of Apotropsin. Tanya Idu, we have another Brisa. Lo Yishchad Adam Lo Yidei Bno Bita Gdolim, V'lo Yidei Avdo V'Shivchasa Ivrim, V'lo Yidei Ishto Elami Datan. In other words, the authority, the power to create a minui on a Korban Pesach is in the hands of these, of the children who are already past Gadlus, of the Hebrew slaves, of a wife. They have the ultimate authority. Therefore, nothing can happen without their approval. And in such a case that we didn't have their approval, then we have a problem of brera if later on they give their approval. Unless there's only one Korban Pesach and not two, and the assumption is that it's certainly on their benefit and it operates to their benefit that they have a meaning on a Korban Pesach. So this brisa is pretty much a repeat and a summary of what we learned before. But now the brisa adds something important. The chulon and all the cases included in this brisa, sheshachatu v'shachat rabban aleim yotzim b'shal rabban v'enon yotzim b'shal atz. Now the case is that the Eved or the Shivcha went ahead and shechted a Korban Pesach on their own behalf. The Adon, the master, on the other hand, shechted a different Korban on their behalf. So in that case, because of the special status of Balabayis, as we said before, all the power is invested in his arms, in his hands. Therefore, Yotzim B'Shal Rabban, Ve'enim Yotzim B'Shal Atzma. Isha is the exception, because as we said before, Isha is the original source. She has her own powers to determine which Korban Pesach she wants to be money on. And Yechola Limchos, we need her approval. If the husband brings and designates a Korban Pesach on her behalf and she disapproves, then her husband cannot force her to accept that minui on the Korban Pesach. So the Gemara asks the following question: Maishna Isha, why do you single out Isha here? you should have mentioned Avdo v'shivchaso ha'ivrim, or Bino ubito hagdolim. They too have the authority to determine the Korban Pesach, and they also have the veto power, limchos, to object to the Korban Pesach was designated either by their biological father in the case of Bino Bito Hagdolim, or by the Adon in the case of Avdo v'Shivchas HaIvrim. You shouldn't take Isha as an exclusive category, but rather as a generic category, and it's representative of all those who have the authority, they have the das in and of themselves, whether it be the Avdot Shivchas HaIvrim, B'no Bito Hagdolim, they're all in the same exact category as the Isha. And they could designate a Korban Pesach on their behalf. No one could force them to accept a Korban Pesach unless they give approval. Now, at this point in the Sugya, the Gemara addresses the following issue. How do we understand those who have their own vested authority, and they could be mafresh, they could designate their own Korban Pesach? What is the relationship between that and their Adon or the Baal? Is it A or B? A is that the Baal or the Adon in the case of the Eved could go ahead and designate a Korban Pesach on their behalf without their upfront approval, as long as they don't protest. So we don't really need their das, their approval in a positive sense. It's enough that they were makabel, they were passively accepted whatever was done on their behalf. That's A. The other way of understanding is that no, you have to get their approval in the case of Isha, of B'no Bito Hagdolim, the case of Eved Ivri. In all those cases, you have to get their approval up front. So the Gemara says that on this issue, we have a contradiction in the Brisa itself, Agufa Kasha. Why? Amrit. In the Brisa, the words appear, Kulam Yotzim B'Shel Rabbah. Right? We have Kulam Sheshachtu B'Shachtu Rabbah. It's Yotzim B'Shel Rabbah. That implies that you don't need their approval up front. So we're talking about an Eved Ivri, and it says Yotzim B'Shel Rabbah. Because the word v'chulon indicates that any category that was mentioned early in the ratio of the Brisa is included in the premise, in the principle of Yotzim B'Shel Rabbah. And Yotzim B'Shel Rabbah means that even if the Rav, the Adon, designated a Korban Pesach on their behalf without their knowledge, it still is valid. But then it says Chutz Mina Isha Sheyechola Limchos. So the word v'chulon seems to indicate all the above, and then you have the Isha as the only exception. Now, how can you tell me that in the case of Isha, that's the only exception? But the question of the Gemara actually goes even beyond that, because the Brisa says Isha yechola limchos, and that's going to address our issue, namely whether or not the Baal has the right, even without her approval up front, to designate a Korban Pesach on her behalf. And the phrase Shel Yechola Limchos indicates that he can go ahead and designate a Korban Pesach on her behalf as long as we don't have a subsequent protest on her behalf. She never objected. Taimo, says the Gemara, why is it that she, when she designates a Korban Pesach, she will be yotze with her Korban Pesach, not with the Korban Pesach that her Baal designated on her behalf? The Machi, because she made a Macha. Alo Machi, the implication is that in the absence of her protest, if she did not exercise her veto power, Nafka B'Shel Baila, she will be yotze with the Baila, meaning with the Korban Pesach that was designated on her behalf by her husband, for Ketani Reisha. But yet we go back to the Reisha, it says Lo Al Yidei Ishto. Elamidatma. And if we read that carefully, it means we have to have a positive expression of approval from her, from the Isha up front. Habistama, if on the other hand she never expressed her opinion about it, lo nafka, then she cannot be yotze with his carbon pesach on her behalf, but rather she has to bring her own carbon pesach. So the more answers, my elamidaton, when the Brisa says that he cannot shech the carbon pesach on their behalf unless they gave their upfront approval, lav di amri, it doesn't mean that they have to explicitly express their positive opinion, their approval. Ella bistama, all we need is that they say nothing and that they're absolutely passive. To the exclusion of a situation where later on they protest. But when the Brisa mentions this special veto power, and it means that they don't want to be yotze with his carbon pesach, the husband's carbon pesach, and he can't force his shchita upon them, that's only in a case where she expressed her objection. She protested. But in the absence of such an expression, then the husband could, in fact, bring the carbon pesach and designate it on her behalf. The Gemara is not happy yet. The Brisa says that in all cases, if the Adon, the owner of the Eved, shechted the carbon pesach on their behalf, they could be yotze with that carbon pesach. Did bistama, and this is a case of a din that applies even bistama. They didn't say explicitly they want him to include them in his carbon pesach. Uktani, and on this the Brisa says chutz min ha'isha mipnei sheyichol limchos, and it means that even in a case of stama, she cannot be yotze with his, because we said that there's a contrast here between the Adon vis-a-vis his avodim and the Isha, and the Baal vis-a-vis the Isha. In the case of the Adon vis-a-vis the avodim, then we go with mistama, meaning that if they didn't protest, that's fine. And the Adon could bring the carbon pesach on their behalf in the absence of an objection. But then the Brisa says, chutz min ha'isha. Apparently, in the case of an Isha, you need her approval up front. Rava says, no, you don't need her approval up front. But what does it mean, yichola yilimchos? Kevan shechchato, ein lecha michui gadol mizeh. If she went ahead, or in the case of the Eved Ivri, and they shechted the carbon for themselves, that itself is a mecha. And that's what the Brisa means when it says Yecholim Limchos. Yecholim Limchos means that by bringing their own and designating their own carbon pesach, that is a mecha. The Mishnah continues, Eved shel shnei shutfim lo yochal mishem shneim. So you have an Eved that's owned by two partners, and each partner designated a carbon pesach on behalf of his Eved. And the Mishnah says that in such a case, the Eved cannot eat from either carbon pesach, because this is a case of undetermined. We have to set up a minui at the time of the shechita. And since we don't know which of the two karbonos the Eved will sign on, therefore, he cannot eat from either carbon pesach. Ramile Rav Eina Saba Rav Nachman. So here's an objection that's raised by Rav Eina. Tanan, we learned that Mishnah Eved shel shnei shutfim lo yochal mishel shneim. V'asanya, don't we have a brisa with regard to an Eved that's owned by two partners? Rotza mizeh ochel, rotza mizeh ochel. The Eved will make his decision as to which carbon pesach he wants to eat from. And that brisa seems to contradict our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says, Lo yochal mishel shneim. He will not be able to decide which of the two karbanos he will eat from. He's excluded from both. Amalei, so Rav Nachman responds, Eina Sava, he calls him by his first name, the Amrila, and others say that this was the language that he used, Pasya Ukma, but Mine Umina. If you have something that's unclear, it's like black, then it will be explained, it will be clarified by you and me. In other words, you'll ask the kasha and I'll give you the teretz. And as a result, we'll be able to clarify the so-called stira, the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Bryce. It's time shmaitata. And as a result, we'll be able to be miyashev the sugya. We'll find the emes in the sugya. Masnisin, the Mishnah that says that the Eved is excluded from both because the Shutfim are fighting with each other. The Kabte Adad, each Shutaf, each partner that owns his chelik in the Eved is vying for competition. He doesn't want his other buddy to benefit in a way that undermines him. So if he wants the Eved to be with him on Pesach and eat the korban Pesach that he designated on behalf of the Eved, he doesn't want the other partner should be able to designate a korban Pesach for the Eved. There's a kpeda, they're at loggerheads. They're pulling from both sides like a tug of war. And therefore, the Eved can't eat from either one of them. But the Bryce is talking about a case, the low kapti adad, where you have mutual shutfim that are friendly with each other. They have a friendly open door policy, they're not makpid one on the other. And in such a case, if each Adon designated korban Pesach, he's not makpid if, let's say, the Eved decides to go with the other guy's korban Pesach. But then we get to the case of Chetzio Eved v'Chetzio ben Chorin lo yochal mishel Rabba. What happened is that one of the two shutfim freed the Eved, gave up on his half of the Eved, so we now have a Chatzi ben Chorin. On the other hand, the other partner that owned the Eved did not release the Eved, so the Eved is now a schizophrenic of sorts. He's half Eved and half ben Chorin, which is a major sugya all of the Shas. In our context, he cannot eat from the korban pesach that was designated by the Adon that owns half of it. So the Gemara asks, Mishal Rabbo Hudalo Yochal, Mishal Atzmo Yochal. The Mishnah is implying that the problem here is that the Rav, since he only owns half the Eved, doesn't have the power, the authority to be mafresh a korban pesach on behalf of the Eved, but the Eved could certainly go out, this Chatzi Eved Chatzi could certainly go out and designate a korban pesach on behalf of himself. So the Gemara asks, for Tanya, we have a brayso, lo yochal lo mishalo, below mishal Rav. That this Eved, who's half Eved, half ben Chorin, cannot eat the korban pesach, neither from his Adon, who only owns half of him, nor if he himself is mafresh a korban pesach on his own behalf, because again, he's a Chatzi Evet. So the Chatzi Avdut Shabo sort of blocks his ability to designate a korban pesach. Whereas that Mishnah says the problem is Mishal Rabbah, implying that Mishal Atzmo, he could designate a korban pesach. Lo kasha, the Gemara answers, kan, the Mishnah Rishona, kan, the Mishnah Achrona. Mishnah Rishona means that historically, chronologically, at one point early in history, there was a major machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai as to the status of, or the relationship between the Adon, who owns half the Eved, and the Eved, who owns half of himself. And the machlokas is, let's start with the Shita Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai says, in this case, Kofanis Rabba L'Chakara, that the Bezdin has the right to force the Adon to release his half ownership over the Eved. And we'll see the reason for that in just a minute. Beis Hillel disagree. They hold initially, in the first stage of chronological history, they held, no, the Chatzi Eved Shabo, which is owned by the Adon, that remains fixed in stone. Nobody, not any Bezdin on the face of the earth, has the power, the authority to force the Adon to give up half the Evet. He owns half the Evet. That's a very lucrative ownership. He'll get half of the dividends, half of the, the employment wages. He doesn't want to give up, and then you can't force him. That's the Mishnah Rishon. And let's read the Mishnah Rishona inside. And this is in the fourth parak of Gittin. Desnan Misha Chetzi Eved Chetzi Ben Chorin. According to Beis Hillel, the ratio of this brisa is Oved Es Rabba Yom Echad, Ves Atzmo Yom Echad. There are two owners of this Eved, and that's a permanent halachic status. There's the Adon, who owns half the Eved, and then there's the Eved himself, who's half Ben Chorin. He owns himself. So every other day, he'll get a day off because he's working for himself. In other words, Beis Hillel validate this state of Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin continuously, perpetually. There's nothing that's going to stop it. Beit Shammai Omrim, and here we'll turn to the top of Daf Pei Ches Amud Beis. Tikantem es Rabo, but as Atzma lo tikantem. Yes, the Rav will get to use the Eved according to Beis Hillel every other day. That's fine. The Rav has half the Eved, and he'll be satisfied. That's all he can get is every other day. But the Eved himself is put in a very difficult situation. Why? Vis-a-vis marriage. Lisa Shivchaina Yachol Shekvar Chetzi Ben Chorin. Half of him is Ben Chorin. And a Jew is not allowed to marry a Shivcha. That's an Isolav of Kadeshus. So why don't we tell him to marry a Bas Chorin? Lisa Bas Chorin and Yachol Chadain Chetzi Eved. The half Eved Shabo generates an Isur Kadeshus vis-a-vis a Jewish girl. A Jewish girl cannot marry an Eved nor a half an Eved. So this man is in a predicament, a no-win, no-win situation. There's no win over here. Is he bottom? He cannot marry anyone. So the question is, can we, the halachic mind, accept and validate a situation of a halachic situation of a status of a man who cannot marry anyone? For Allah, don't you agree to a pasuk in Yeshayahu Hanavi? Lo nivra ha'olam el lepiri v'rivya shenemar lo sohu bra la sheves yitzara. God created the world that it should be populated, and He wants every individual to chip in and contribute, get married, and have a child, at least one child. This is the famous shita of Beit Shammai, that we, Bezdin, will force the Adon for the benefit of his Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin to release, to free his Avdus, his ownership over the Chatzi Eved, but also Ben Chorin. Now he becomes a full-fledged Jew. The Kosef Shtar al Chatzi Domov, the Eved himself is going to have to commit himself to pay half of his domim. So on a monetary level, even Beit Shammai agreed that the Chatzi Eved that's owned by the Adon is private property. And if for the sake of the mitzvah period of Rivi, you force the Adon to give up his Eved and release him, he has to get reimbursed for that on a monetary level. But then, Chazu Beis Hillel lahoros ki Beit Shammai. The Mishnah Achrona, which was the last final opinion of Beis Hillel, is they accepted the position, they conceded that Beit Shammai are right. We cannot tolerate this situation, let it go on endlessly, where this poor Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin could not marry anyone. So we're going to be Kofanis Rab. Now, in the light of the Mishnah Rishona, the Mishnah Achrona, we now can reconcile the contradiction between our Mishnah and the Brisa. How so? We said that according to our Mishnah, you know what? I think it's easier. We'll start with the Brisa, because the Brisa is represented by the Mishnah Rishona. So we'll go through it historically. So the Brisa says that in the case of Chetzio Eved Chetzi Ben Chorin, Lo yochal, lo mishalo, lo mishel rabbo. The Eved does not even have the right to designate his own korban pesach for himself. Why not? Because we're holding like the Mishnah Mishona, and we're reflecting the sheet of Beis Hillel. And Beis Hillel say that he still remains forever and ever a Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chor. And the Chatzi Eved Shabo will block his ability to set up a korban pesach on his own behalf. The Chatzi Ben Chorin Shabo will block the Adon from setting up a korban pesach on behalf of the Eved on the Chatzi Eved Shabo. And therefore, this Eved is in a serious predicament. He cannot neither fulfill his obligation to korban pesach through the designation of the Adon, nor can he designate his own korban pesach. But our Mishnah reflects the Mishnah Achrona that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are in agreement, that Beis Hillel eventually conceded that Kofano Sach Yoma Rotzani. So the Eved now has the rights to demand a Shtar Shikr to be released by his Adon on the Chatzi Eved Shabo, and therefore he can designate his own korban pesach.